we all know Spain. We all know the Second World War. But what about Spain and the Second World War? Because Spain was fascist, right? It was also a neutral country. Yet the country did send volunteers, the Blue Division, to fight alongside the Germans on the Eastern Front. So what about this? Well, I got you covered. In this video, we're gonna talk about División Azul, the so-called Blue Division, the Spanish volunteers in the Second World War on the Eastern Front. Stay tuned. Hey, good to have you back on the channel, and if you're happy to be new on this channel, well, my name is Stefan, I'm a history teacher, I'm from the Netherlands, not from Spain, and I'm hustling history for you, and if you liked it, then please consider subscribing, and if you do so, do not forget to hit the notification bell so you will become part of the hustle. Let's start. We're going to speak about their recruitment, training, as well as life on the front, the fighting, also the relations between them and the German soldiers, as well as the Soviet citizens and the Jews. And watch this video till the end, because I might tell you some things you have never heard of before. The Spanish Civil War was the prelude of the formation of the Blue Division. Now I know this conflict is a very complicated conflict. What you need to know for now is in the second half of the 1930s, a deadly civil war broke out in Spain, where the ideologies of the left and the right clash, and it was basically a prelude for the Second World War. It all started with a coup in 1936 by nationalists that overthrew the unstable Second Spanish Republic, which had existed only from 1931. It overthrew the Popular Front movement that represented moderate left and far left-wing parties. Those on the right called themselves the Nationalists, and those on the left called themselves the Republicans. The May Days of 1937 proved the Republicans weren't as united when factions on the Republican side engaged one another. Eventually, the Nationalists, led by Francisco Franco, would proclaim victory because of their more professional units, the securing of the economy and the food supply, their order behind the lines, and their extensive foreign backing. One of the backing legions was the Condor Legion, which consisted of German troops that fought on the side of nationalists during the Civil War. During the latter half of the year 1940, fascist leader Francisco Franco did consider joining the war as an ally of Germany. Franco had his eye on the French Empire in North Africa, yet during a meeting with Hitler, he was only willing to give him Gibraltar and some vague promises about North Africa. Given the fact that Spain just came out of a devastating civil war, Franco was willing to join Hitler when there was a minimum risk. The war would be won in a few months, as well as a maximum reward, gaining control of North Africa. This was not the prospect. So, in December 1940, Franco rejected Hitler's request to join the war with the excuse that Spain was not prepared for it. Franco was aware of Hitler's annoyances, so when his brother-in-law, Ramon Serrano Suñer, also Minister of Foreign Affairs, prominent member of the Falange, proposed the idea of a volunteer unit to aid the Germans in their invasion of the Soviet Union, and Franco approved. And then it was June 1941. Germany invaded the Soviet Union, and something happened that didn't even happen in Germany itself. It happened in Spain, and I'm talking about widespread pro-German demonstrations and celebrations.
Pero es en el sur donde suena el formidable grito acusatorio contra Rusia. Es en la soleada calle de Alcalá donde una juventud sin pareja en el mundo se vuelve a alzar, inagotable de entusiasmo, contra el enemigo del Este. España, de polo a polo, se siente estremecida por el grito de la cruzada, lo más selecto de la joven generación madrileña, la flor de su falange, heroica y fundadora, la aristocracia de la universidad, del campo y del taller, pide un sitio en la división que se forma bajo el nombre de División Azul.
from the get-go, Serrano Suñer was working out his idea of a Spanish legion. The Germans had helped them, the nationalists, in defeating the Republicans during the Civil War, which the anti-Republicans deemed them as communist. Now it was time for Spain to help Germany in defeating the communists in the East. This legion had to consist of volunteers from the Falange Party, which was the only political party. It was a fascist party that wasn't prohibited in Spain after Franco's victory over the Republicans in the Civil War. Franco had united the old Falange with the Carlists and monarchists to form the new Falangist party. Well, here you see the whole name. So why was the Blue Division called blue? The Spanish flag doesn't have any blue. Well, blue refers to the blue shirts that were worn by the Phalangists. Now, do understand here that there was a severe competition between the Phalangist party and the Spanish military. See, the Phalangist Serrano Suñer, he did not want the Spanish army to interfere with his idea of the Blue Division, and he had an argument for that, because if the Spanish military would interfere with this idea, it basically came down to the fact that Spain would have to declare war to the USSR. To me, the clever thing about this division is that the Germans should see us as sincere, and that in some way, with the modest means which we have, we take the part of action, but not as a nation, but some Spaniards who have the right to be pro-German and to be volunteers. So what we see here is that Serrano Suñer, he wanted to walk the fine line between helping Germany in conquering the East and defeating the communists, but not being part as a co-belligerent, so to say, or an Axis power. Germany approved the idea of the Blue Division and welcomed it, but they also tried to extract the declaration of war of Spain to the USSR. The Blue Division did come, the declaration of war did not. The man who took control of the Blue Division was Agustín Muñoz Grandes, a general with Falangist sympathies, albeit not a member of this party. Recruits had to be a Falangist member or serve in the military. The age was between 20 and 28, and they had to pass a medical examination. Near the end of June 1941, enlistment started. The first contingent was around 18,000 men. Thousands were placed on waiting lists. 1/3 came from the army, another 2/3 from the Falange. Around 4,000 of them were university students. The Falange recruited civilians so these could serve in the Blue Division. Many of these were conservatives, monarchists, or Catholics, and shared the anti-communist sentiments of the Phalangists. Many of them had relatives who had surrendered at the hands of the Popular Front, the Republicans, during the Civil War. Others wanted to fight communism, especially because they didn't have the occasion to do so during the Civil War, because during the Civil War they weren't old enough, or they were imprisoned by the Republicans or trapped in a Republican-controlled territory and enlisted to fight for them. Where those enlisting in 1941 did so out of enthusiasm for the crusade against communism, those enlisting in the subsequent years were well aware of the hardships of the Eastern Front and did so out of career prospects. The numbers of the volunteers began to dwindle, especially when the Allies took full control of northern Africa and were now facing Spanish troops located in Spanish Morocco. An Allied invasion was feared, and thus sending men over to the Eastern Front seemed like a less viable option than protecting the home country. As Italy fell and Germany was losing the war, the Spanish leaders wanted to repatriate the Blue Division. Later in this video, more about how the members of the Blue Division ended up. Around 45,000 Spaniards would take part in the campaign. In July 1941, the first wave of volunteers were transported via train to Germany. Some send-offs witnessed a big fanfare. others were more modest. In Germany, the Spaniards were object of attention and curiosity by the local population. The training took place in Bavaria in the Grafenwöhr military camp. There they were handed German uniforms and equipment, and many Spaniards were surprised by the diversity of this equipment, and thus the training began. The Spaniards proved to be good students since many of them came from university and therefore had intellectual capacities. The training was speeded up, and this was due to several reasons. First of all, many Spaniards had military experience from the Spanish Civil War. Another reason was that the Spanish were afraid that the war would have been over by the time their training would be complete. Little did they know. Another reason was given by historian Xavier Moreno Julia in the book edited by David Stahlhelm, Joining Hitler's Crusade. One of the chief sources of friction was the Spanish treatment of German women, those working in the canteens and even those accompanying German men. Improper comments and attitudes evoked anger and contempt among the Germans, ending in brawls and even the odd pistol shot. At two separate ceremonies, one in July and one in August, the Spaniards were sworn in and pledged their allegiance to Hitler and fight against Bolshevism. The Blue Division earned its official status as the 250th Division of the Wehrmacht. Now it's interesting that the Spanish army had modeled itself on the French army, and therefore the concept of blitzkrieg was new to the Spaniards, and even the training couldn't replace this thinking. Yet the Spanish tactics proved in handy when Hitler ordered his standfast order after the Soviet winter offensive. After the Germans took the initiative again, the Spanish weaknesses became apparent. The static Leningrad front proved to be ideal for the Spaniards. However, there were some practical difficulties, for example, the language barrier, and also the Spanish attitude toward war in general. The Spanish Legion, which represented the elite in Spanish fighting units, cultivated a valor of an almost suicidal nature, and their battle cry was Viva la Muerte, which translates rather paradoxically as long live death. For their part, the Phalangists, like all fascist movements, had made the cult of their fallen comrades the most important part of their rituals. For them, sacrificing one's life in combat was the highest form of valor. On August 20th, the march towards the Soviet Union began. After 53 days, they arrived, a journey which took place mostly on foot. Given the fact that the Spaniards believed the Germans were fully motorized, the arduous journey affected morale. From Suwalki, a 900-kilometer march was undertaken, which led them to Smolensk. A distance of 30 to 40 kilometers had to be covered each day. The atmosphere was really mixed. The men sang songs and traded with the local population, but passing through the devastated landscape and seeing all these refugees and war violence, this also affected the morale, and the Spaniards knew they were not here for an easy time. Now officially, the Spaniards would take part in the drive on Moscow, but this was later changed and they were allocated to Army Group North. The real reason for this were the negative reports about the lack of professional behavior and proper manners. A report stated the following: the Spaniards view grooming the horses as a bother, feeding them unnecessary. Belts and suspenders are cut from new harnesses. Gas mask containers are often used as coffee pots. Dust and driving glasses are cut from gas masks themselves. If a Spaniard has corns, he cuts appropriate holes in his shoes and boots to keep them from chafing. Rifles are often sold. New bicycles are thrown away as they find tire repair too boring. The MG34 is often assembled with the help of a hammer. Parts left over during assembly are buried. They consider all women fair game. In Grodno, there were orgies with Jewesses who were taken along in their vehicles. Now, obviously, German I just can't pronounce this word. Well, that played a role in their view towards the Spaniards. Field Marshal Günther von Kluge, he asked if the Spanish were gypsies or soldiers. Via Vibetsk, the Spaniards traveled to Novgorod and arrived on the Volkhov front mid-October. Already in October, temperatures plummeted. The coldest Russian winter in many years was about to begin. Appropriate clothing was missing. After crossing the Volkhov River, the Spaniards captured several towns, but near the end of that month, Soviet counterattacks drove them back. Around 80 Spaniards and 250 Soviet soldiers were killed. Mid-November, they fought at Posad, which was abandoned early December. Over 100 Spaniards lost their lives. By now, the temperatures reached minus 40 degrees Celsius. General Muñoz Grandes ordered the retreat across the Volkhov River, where the Spaniards dug in. Over the course of that month, relentless fighting took place. The Blue Division would be stationed in this area until August 42, after which they went further to Leningrad and its deployment ended in October 43. After this, over 2,000 men would continue to fight in the Blue Legion till 1944. From then till the end of World War II, over 100 volunteers would continue to fight in the 101st SS Spanish Volunteer Company and saw action in the Battle of Berlin. I also read about 150 Portuguese served in the Blue Division, but I couldn't find a proper source to confirm this. So how was life on the Eastern Front for the Spaniards? As noticed, the Spaniards had suffered tremendously due to the cold and the harsh first winter on the front. But the cold wasn't the first weather condition that hindered the Spanish, because before that there was the Russian autumn, the autumn of mud, also known as the Rasputitsa, which rendered roads unuseful for vehicles. The environment of the Volkhov, thick as swampy forests, was new to these South Europeans. And then there was the winter. For the Spaniards, who are mostly accustomed to warm weather, this was of great shock that affected morale greatly. I read that the best medical handbooks in the 1950s were actually written by a veteran who served for the Blue Division. Many Spaniards suffered from frostbite, yet their fighting spirit kept them from crumbling completely. Veterans remembered the cold as one of the most difficult experiences of the campaign, and it was always a matter of pride for them that they had overcome it. The second winter was less cold, and by now adequate winter clothing was available. Now, as I said before, the Spaniards weren't accustomed to the war movement and more relied on static defense. However, the static defense of the Leningrad front was a world away from the warfare during the Civil War, because during the Civil War, life in the trenches was tedious and boring and nothing much happened. However, on the Eastern Front, there was constant danger. Artillery strikes and trench raids claimed many casualties. Even in the quiet sectors of the front, there were many casualties. Digging trenches and fortified positions was extremely disliked by the Spanish soldiers, who preferred dying on their feet instead of dying like a rat in a hole. The first 3 months of 1942, 3 battalions of replacement soldiers were sent. A total of 19 battalions arrived in the USSR in 1942 and 8 battalions in 1943. A system of rotation was introduced. At first, the idea of a second Blue Division to replace the original one was initiated, but not approved, since the Germans believed it wouldn't be wise to replace soldiers who had grown battle-hardened and accustomed to the conditions of the Eastern Front. Later, battalions were repatriated, 8 in 1942 and 5 in 1943. Some repatriated signed up again. Officers were rotated more frequently, which had a negative effect on the units. Eventually, the whole Blue Division would be repatriated. I'll get to that in a second. Now, let's first discuss the Spanish relations with the Germans, and later the relations with the local population in the Soviet Union. As said before, the deviant Spanish behavior led to frictions with the German soldiers. On an official level and propaganda, the Germans praised the Blue Division. However, in reports, a different view is presented. The Germans were mostly preoccupied with the fact that the Spanish soldiers lacked discipline. Also, racist views played a part in this. They often left their buttons open and put their hands in their pockets. You see that on many photographs. And this was against the Prussian conduct of militarism. The Germans saw the Spaniards as a disgrace to the German uniform. The Germans, they did care. The Spaniards, they couldn't care less. Spanish commanders, they found it difficult to punish their own troops, who in the first place had followed them all across Europe to fight in the East. Several hundreds of volunteers were sent back due to reasons of left-wing sympathies as well as the lack of discipline. 100 men served prison sentence, and I read that even one death penalty was carried out. And behind the front line, for example, in the German city of Königsberg, now Kaliningrad, there were even often bar brawls between Germans and Spanish soldiers, which was mostly due to the pursuit of women. I do need to mention that this critical German attitude and the reports was also the case when German officers observed Romanian, Italian, Hungarian troops as well as other foreign volunteers served in the SS. The Spaniards, they were shocked by how local Poles, Jews and Soviet citizens were treated by the Germans. What is interesting is that many Spaniards actually shared an affection towards the local Soviet citizens, where the Germans saw the Soviet citizens as inferior Slavs and Bolsheviks that needed to be dealt with. This wasn't the case for the Spanish soldiers. I read that Spanish commanders at Krasny Bor ordered the field kitchen to reserve meals for local children and elderly. And as the Spanish troops were relocated to other areas, it often happened that local civilians moved alongside with them. And some had even Russian girlfriends. Another reason that they didn't share the same hatred as the Germans did was due to the fact that they were located so far away from home. The USSR had never been a direct threat to them. Yeah, sure, the USSR did provide assistance to the Republicans during the Civil War, but they weren't seen as an enemy. It doesn't mean that the Spaniards weren't racist looking at their policy in Northern Africa. And sure, many Spaniards were anti-Semites, but the thing is that their anti-Semitism wasn't racially like the German anti-Semitism, but culturally, because they saw the Jews as the killer of Christ. And therefore the Spanish behavior to the local Jewish population was much different. There is no evidence Spanish soldiers took part in mass murdering the Jewish population. Heck, there were even Jewish nurses that served for the Blue Division. The Spaniards felt the most affection to the Poles, simply due to the fact that both the Spaniards and the Poles practiced Roman Catholicism. Towards Soviet POWs, it's a different story, and there are many examples where Soviet soldiers that surrendered were shot on the spot. On the morning of the 27th of December, when 3 Soviet battalions attacked one Spanish position and killed all the defenders, 20 Spaniards and some German sappers, the Soviets also mutilated the corpses, which provoked a Spanish counterattack that, according to Spanish records, killed hundreds of Russians, a figure which may be explained by an order that prohibited the taking of Soviet prisoners. While relations with the civilian population remained positive on many levels, the treatment of Soviet POWs was, as seen earlier, much more fraught. There was no lack of divisionados who killed them at point-blank range after surrender or robbed them of their boots, which condemned them to losing their feet from frostbite. I think that these Spanish atrocities were mostly due as a retaliation to the Soviet brutalities and German encouragement. It shows that the Spaniards were dragged into the war of annihilation to a certain extent, but not fully, since they did not commit atrocities to the local civilian population simply due to the fact that they didn't share the racial doctrines of the Germans. Interesting enough, Spanish veterans were invited to St. Petersburg to commemorate the end of the Second World War in 2005. The first Spanish battalions arrived back in Spain in 1942, the last ones in the spring of 1944. Spain's ambitions for obtaining Gibraltar and North Africa were dashed. As Germany was losing the war, Franco's regime did its best to distance itself from the Axis powers, and thus the memory of the Blue Division became a taboo. The Blue Division had become an uncomfortable relic and perhaps remains that till this day. A total of 45,000 men served in the Blue Division. An estimated 5,000 had been killed in action and 20,000 wounded in action. Between 1941 and 1945, the Red Army captured 464 Spanish soldiers. 70 of these were actually deserters who went over to the Soviet side. These were all held captive till 1954 and some till 1956, while most other German allied nationalities were released earlier, and this was due to the fact that Franco's Spain had never established diplomatic relations with the USSR. 130 died in Soviet captivity. Thanks to my patrons, and a special thanks to Peter King, Tanya Dixie, Henry Clarkson, Rob Park, RL, and Colin Castleman. If you want to know more about French volunteers on the Eastern Front, you can click right here. Do not forget to like, to comment, to share, Facebook, Reddit, Twitter. Thanks for watching, subscribe, and I'll see you later.